Load shedding is estimated to cost the economy hundreds of millions of rand each day. The potential loss of jobs due to the power crisis is equally alarming. So as ordinary South Africans brace for more power outages in the foreseeable future, households face increased costs as they opt for alternative energy sources. The cost of running a generator, for example, is proving prohibitive for many households, as are high gas prices. Repairing and replacing damaged appliances is another issue. So Dr. Azar Jamime is the chief economist at Econometrix. He joins us now to unpack the various hidden costs of load shedding on households. Dr. Jamime, it's great to have you with us on the show this morning. And this is a big issue, isn't it? Because when things start to break down in your home as a direct result of load shedding and the stress of constant blackouts on appliances, etc., where does one go to claim?
One can't actually go to claim.
Yeah.
It turns out to be a loss. And unfortunately, it's yet another one of those factors, as was the case with COVID-19, that exacerbates inequalities in the country, because it is the poor who really are completely at sea and cannot cope with load shedding, whereas wealthier persons can adopt measures and can buy solar heating, can buy generators and that sort of thing to try and bypass the effects of load shedding. Those who work in the corporate sector are not that badly affected because their offices, if they're working at work, all have generators, but it's your small businesses who cannot afford generators who suffer the most.
Yeah.
So that is, unfortunately, it's like with COVID-19, where the people who lost their jobs or got pay cuts were the ordinary working class and the small businesses who really suffered from the lockdowns. Big businesses had the reserves with which to cope with that. And most of your middle and upper income persons are still gainfully employed. It's your lower income people who've lost their jobs. We've seen, for example, that, compared with the situation just before COVID, GDP is just 1% less than what it was, but employment is about 8% less than what it was.
Yeah. I mean, a simple issue like, just taking it back to the household discussion, Dr. Jamime, a simple issue like food going off in a fridge because of constant
Correct.
Power outages. Again, that's something that will no doubt hit poorer households much harder. The point I'm making is that, we often talk about the cost of load shedding to the economy, which runs into hundreds of millions of rand. How do we count the associated costs?
It's very difficult with so many of these things. You look at the GDP, it doesn't actually tell you exactly how evenly or unevenly spread the effects of growth or non-growth really are on the economy. And you've given a great classic example of food going off. Poor people struggle to buy that food, and yet it goes off because they can't freeze it, whereas wealthier people have generators or solar energy to keep the stuff frozen, so they don't actually lose out on that scale. Having said that, what I have picked up is that Eskom's load shedding schedule has reduced the amount of time for load shedding. You now have load shedding more frequently than before, but for less time than before. In previous years, load shedding spurts would be of the order of 4.5 hours. Now they're more like 2.5 hours. If you're lucky, but I have to say that because in many instances people end up with having no power for 4, 5, 6 hours because of additional knock-on problems resulting from load shedding, the interruptions to the electricity supply, which you alluded to some extent.
So Dr. Jamime, we're now on the eve of the maiden medium-term budget policy statement by the new-ish finance minister. In terms of, how we are hoping what we'll hear tomorrow will in some way reflect some of the struggles of ordinary South Africans insofar as load shedding and many other issues are concerned, the unemployment numbers being at a record high for one. What do we hope to hear from Enoch Golongwana tomorrow?
The problem that he has is, at this stage, it's very difficult to forecast what the impact of load shedding on the overall economy is going to be going forward. How serious is that load shedding going to be? If you have the kind of stage 4 load shedding that we've had this week persisting, it will have a very definite negative effect on economic growth, and through that on the tax revenues that will be collected by the government. And under such circumstances, government will have less available to spend on looking after the poor and the unemployed. Conversely, if this is just a once-off, as Andre de Ruyter kind of, he didn't say it's a once-off, but he said, Eskom is not about the grid is not about to collapse. In other words, yes, we will have load shedding from time to time, and this is a bad spot right now, but it's not going to last indefinitely. Then the impact on economic growth is not going to be that bad, and the government can then rely on extra revenues. The other uncertainty is that a lot of the additional revenue that government has collected this year has been as a result of the relative strength of the world economy and the fact that commodity prices have been high. So company profits, especially of mining companies, have been soaring ahead, and so they've been paying a lot more tax. But we cannot rely on that to continue indefinitely. It may well do so, but we can't rely on that. So government's got to do a big challenge in terms of balancing what it can reasonably expect in terms of revenues and how much that can accommodate spending on social services. We've already seen this year that the government has allocated 39 billion rand extra to rescue people who've been affected by lockdowns and by the looting and social unrest experience in July. But the big question on people's minds is how much more can they really afford to splash out on social, looking after people.
Yeah, absolutely. And that economic growth that you talk about, the latest forecast putting us at 5% for 2021, everything that you've just mentioned means that is under threat.
It's partly under threat. Remember, most of the year has already passed, and a lot of the numbers have already been reasonably good. Yeah. So for 2021, the 5% is still feasible, and I wouldn't say that is under threat. I think what is more under threat is 2022, if the load shedding continues. And already we can see, most of the forecasts for economic growth for next year are in the region of 2%, not 5%. So people have taken that into account already in their forecast.
In terms of, the other big issues that we want to hear from the Finance Minister, and I think you touched on it just a moment ago, Dr. Jamime, the issues around social income grants. How much movement is there insofar as we are able to provide for poorer South Africans that we've been talking about, worst affected by issues like load shedding? The Minister himself talked about an income grant, a family income grant that may replace the COVID-19 grant in some way. But does our budget give us that freedom of movement just a little bit compared to our last medium-term budget policy statement?
Well, we have got a little bit more freedom of movement compared with last year, for the simple reason that the economy has outperformed expectations, largely because the world economy has done better and commodity prices have fared well. But as I mentioned, one cannot rely on that necessarily to continue. I think the most that is reasonably and feasible within the realms of fiscal responsibility is to extend the current social grant of 350 Rand a month for individuals who don't have a job. But to consider basic income grant, for me, that's totally unaffordable. The government is looking at trying to replicate the Brazilian example of the Bolsa Familia, this family grant, where they look at households rather than at individuals. And I've seen numbers there. It's kind of on the cusp of affordability, but barely so. And I think, the danger is that if the government says, no, below that, we're going to actually go the full hog and help all the poor the way we feel they need to. I think markets will be very unforgiving, and government will have to end up paying a lot more interest on its debt than is currently the case. So it can turn out to be very counterproductive. It's a very fine balancing act.
Yeah. At the beginning of the week, in his weekly newsletter, President Cyril Ramaphosa talked a lot about the fact that at this time of year we normally hold our investment conferences in South Africa, sometimes in other parts of the world. This week in particular, given the rolling blackouts we've experienced in the country, given a whole range of other issues as well, we're not looking like an attractive destination at the moment, are we?
We haven't looked like an attractive destination for investment for many years. And of course, electricity blackouts have been one of the main reasons why people are reluctant to invest. And we're not only talking about foreign investment, but more so even domestic investment. Having said that, you've got to look at the numbers, and you'll realize that private sector investment in this country has remained a lot stronger than the government and the state-owned enterprises, where investment has really declined, where maintenance has not been kept up, has been in the public sector, where we've seen a decline of some 50 to 60% in investment by public corporations in the last 8 years, and a decline of 30 to 40% by the government itself. It has tended to divert funds that should be directed at maintenance and investment towards funding an ever bigger public service remuneration board.
You talk about private sector investment being quite stable, incredibly. Imagine what it would look like if we could actually keep the lights on. Dr. Azar Jamime, let me thank you for your time this morning. He's the chief economist at Econometrix, talking all things the economy, particularly as we build up to the medium-term budget policy statement, which is happening tomorrow, the maiden one by Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana.